1900 CE to present by Arjun, Louis, and Ali. Decolonization. Causes of decolonization. The decline of European imperialism in this century is rooted in the new Western attitude and the circumstances around the world. The idea of self-government is emphasized in Europe's nation-states. This is a major factor because of the Western educated class in Asia and Africa that start to speak out. With most of Europe weakened by the world wars, imperialists were already planning the process of decolonizing. Along with this, nationalist leaders were able to gain support from the masses, which is the final factor in the mounting pressure for independence. Decolonization of Africa. Africa was united by Pan-African movements that were led by European-educated nationalist leaders. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah used peaceful protests and demonstrations to gain power from the British. The Kenyan revolt was violent and involved armed civilians. The Belgian Congo was liberated very quickly by Belgium, and most Europeans immigrated. South Africa gained independence much earlier than the rest of Africa, but the black majority had no political power in the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela eventually was the first freely elected president who represented the black population. Decolonization in South Asia. In India, the Indian National Congress protected the interests of Indian elites under British rule for more than 20 years up until independence in 1947. The success of the independence movement is due to Mohandas Gandhi and his Ahimsa method of protesting peacefully. But the Muslim minority insisted on having their own country, and they followed through with the cruel separatist movement to form Pakistan. Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh and was intensified in the region because it became a Cold War hotspot. Results of decolonization. After the colonies were freed from European imperialists, they had to find a way to rule themselves. This task was difficult for many countries because the people had little political experience. Many leaders chose socialism as their economic system, and economic growth was driven by the government. World Wars and the Cold War. A Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke of Austria. Serbia denied to comply with an ultimatum presented by Austria. Austria declared war, and a complex alliance system enlarged the war. Imperialism also caused countries to have small battles over colonies. There was an increase in nationalist ethnic tensions, and the mass production of weapons existed for the arms race. This was the spark of World War I. Trench warfare. The creation of machine guns led to armies in World War I to use trench warfare. This tactic made territorial gains throughout the war very minimal and was very deadly for soldiers. There was terrible sanitation, and disease spread very quickly. Although Germany had some short-term advantages, including geographic location and better military training, the introduction of U.S. troops swayed the war into favor of the Allies. Also, the Allies had a larger number of troops as well as a stronger navy, which could enforce blockades. The U.S. troops forced the Central Powers to their breaking point, and armistice was signed. First World War. The First World War was a total as well as a global war. Civilians became legitimate targets of war, and many nations were expected to put their full economic production and political power to be engaged with the military. The war was also global in that European powers asked imperial colonies for help in fighting the war. 1 million Indian troops fought in the war, and the British convinced Arab peoples to unite against the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Versailles and Hitler and the League of Nations. The effects of the world wars were numerous. European economies suffered because of the war, and the US and Japan became economic leaders in the war and the world. Russia's Tsar fell, and a communist Russia rose. Nationalist uprising in the colonies took place, in part due to Wilson's 14 points. Treaties were signed to limit military expansion and reduce the chance of war. In addition, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to take full blame for starting the war, demilitarize, pay billions in reparations to England and France, and create the Weimar Republic. This led to a lot of resentment in Germany as their post-war economy struggled with hyperinflation. The main causes of World War II included the prominence of fascism in Germany, Japan, and Italy. In Italy, fascism arose with Benito Mussolini to address economic and political problems after World War I. Germany's fringe groups of the Nazis rose in power as the people aligned with their views of restoring Germany's former glory. That's because of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler came to complete power during Germany's economic turmoil, appointing himself dictator. He also came to power because of hyperinflation. Germany, Japan, and Italy all invaded surrounding territories during their conversion to fascism. The League of Nations did little to stop the aggression, hoping the fascists would be satisfied with their conquests, but they were really just encouraged. The Axis powers were made up of fascist countries of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allied powers were made up of England, France, Poland, and most of Western Europe by the 1940s. The USSR and US had joined by 1941. China was forced to join with the Allies because of their conflict with Japan. Unlike the slow trench warfare of World War I, World War II incorporated a fast-paced offensive war called the Blitzkrieg. This was made possible by new military technology such as the tank and the airplane. The Nazi invasion of Poland took place in 1939. By 1940, most of Western Europe, including France itself, was under Nazi control. Hitler's first stop took place through the Battle of Britain. Hitler also led an unsuccessful invasion of Russia, and in 1941, the US entered the war. All of this, along with the D-Day invasion in Normandy, pushed German troops back and caused their eventual surrender in 1945. A major part of World War II took place in the Pacific. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and their attack on China. The rape of Nanjing was extremely brutal. In 1941, the fascist country also attacked much of Southeast Asia and many Pacific islands. In 1945, the U.S. started the repeated firebombing of Japanese cities to persuade them to end the war. Eventually, the U.S. suggests the use of atomic weapons. The Holocaust resulted in the death of approximately 10 million people, of whom 6 million were Jews. Firebombings in the Battle of Britain, Dresden, and Tokyo had a total death count of over 145,000 civilians, with many more injured and left homeless. After the war, the United Nations was created as an improved version of the League of Nations. World War II also resulted in the new question of whether atomic weaponry was moral. There were many anti-nuclear movements, but supporters claimed that it actually saved lives in the long run by ending the war sooner. Europe was left economically and socially crippled by the World Wars, and as a result, many of their colonies gained independence after World War II. The Cold War. The Cold War starts after World War II with the emerging difference in political ideologies between the US and the Soviet Union. The most direct conflict between the two sides is the Iron Curtain, where a large part of Europe gained from the victory and under communist rule. Specifically, West Berlin was the one part of Eastern Europe controlled by the US and Britain, and the Berlin Wall was built there and a symbol of the war. The two sides never battled directly, and instead they had proxy wars in Vietnam, Korea, South America, and parts of Africa, where they were sort of used as pawns. These wars were determined if the countries would become capitalist or communist. The end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended with a real climax, but rather because of internal problems in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was in power at the time and reformed with perestroika and glasnost. These reforms gave the people more economic and social freedom. And instead of holding the Soviet Union together, these policies sparked revolutions in Eastern Europe countries. Along with the costly arms race between the superpowers, this led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and ultimately led to the end of the Cold War. Environmentalism and feminism. Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men. Women over the years have continuously fought for equal pay and equal respect, and now this isn't only women in the West. Feminism movements began to reach outside of the West, but it was mostly focusing on economics. An example of that would be equal pay. First wave of feminism. In America, women waited for the day that they could finally vote. Many people thought that the system was unjust, saying that women couldn't vote, so they sought out a solution: strikes. Many rebellions spread throughout the countries in places including London in 1917, which was the Mud March, Washington, D.C. in 1913, which was women's suffrage procession, and New York in 1917, which held lots of rebellions. Western adult women were eventually allowed to vote in the 20th century. Now that they had the right to vote, they sought job equality. A lot of women were getting paid $2 to $3 a week, while men were getting paid $2 to $3 a day. Minimum wage was an increasing issue in America, but many people saw the feminist movements as cultural imperialism due to the fact that it only applied to white women. African Americans began to strike and fight for their own equality rights. In the following years, most patriarchy was lost. Environmentalism. Environmentalism arose in the past century due to man's increasing ability to change the world's environment since the Industrial Revolution. Massive population growth has led to deforestation, and for many countries, economic growth relies on the use of fossil fuels, leading to pollution. Similarly to feminism, environmentalism came in waves. The first wave was mostly poets who sought to raise awareness about man's impact on the issue. The second wave of environmentalism came after Silent Spring. Third world countries' environmentalism were less focused on the use of fossil fuels, and that was because they were fighting for economic rights. Changes in continuities and similarities and differences. The main changes was the decrease of European imperialism, and the global economy and feminism spread around the world. Also, religious fundamentalism increased. The main continuities was the increase of population growth, and West remained at the top. Also, the exploitation of third world countries were kicked out. Similarities. Russia and China both had leaders that promoted communism, and Germany was at the center of World War I and World War II. The main differences were that in World War II they had aerial bombing, such as Blitzkrieg, and they also had fascism existing in World War II.